Welcome to the Rehumanization Station. I'm your collaborator, Christopher Jones, aka Dr. X, and this podcast is an extension to my Flippin' and Vibin brand, where vibers seek to transform narratives in society, education, sport, and a variety of the sectors like today in social work. Today we are starting season 2 of our collaborative Praxis series, so I'm excited, where we have our anti-racist viber named Ray Addai. How you doing with us today? How you doing?
I'm fantastic. The sun's shining.
Yes, that's good.
Yeah, sun's shining, which is it's rare here in the northeast. But yeah, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. Okay, and now Ray is Black British with Ghanaian heritage, born in Newcastle, and works as the anti-racist practice lead in Durham County Council. So today, it's going to be really cool because I was telling you before about how like a lot of my work is around more higher education, society. I never really explored too much of the field in social work, so we've had a few conversations, and I'm excited to have you here today, and we can get more an idea of what racism looks like and what anti-racism looks like in social work. Okay, so now this is the part of the show where you and I just vibe and allow listeners to get an idea of your background and some of your personal interests, right? Mm-hmm. So, all right, what's your story, Ray? Like, tell us a bit about yourself, your birthplace, family, friends.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, born in Newcastle. Both my parents are from Ghana. My dad's been in the UK here since the early 60s. My mum arrived slightly later from Ghana. She arrived in the mid-80s. And they met in London. But prior to that, I mean, my dad came over here as a marine engineer for the Merchant Navy. Because in those days, they recruited from the Commonwealth countries. So as you say, Ghana is a former Commonwealth country. So my dad arrived here, and you can imagine the 60s wasn't necessarily the most welcoming place, particularly for people that look like my dad in the Northeast. But he settled here, bought a house, and there was a number of Ghanaians that were living in the Northeast, and that's quite important, and I'll chat about that later on. So when he met my mum in London, he brought her up to the Northeast and married, and then they had me, and then they had my sister. So when we grew up in the Northeast in Newcastle, bearing in mind this was like the early 90s now, there wasn't many people that looked like me. So it was quite, although my childhood was good, it was fantastic. I had a lot of friends in the schools that I went to. There was some difficulties, as you can imagine. But then I noticed I was about 6 when I had my first sort of experience of what racism actually was and what it felt like. Okay. But I remember at that same age noticing that a lot of my white friends had biological grandparents, biological aunties, you know, in and around their areas and in their families. And me and my sister Cassie, we didn't have that. So going back to the point about my dad being part of a Ghanaian community, they became my aunties, my uncles, my grandparents. That makes sense?
Yes.
Weren't biologically related, but there's a thing in many parts of Africa where if there's an elder person, they are your auntie, they are your uncle. And that's what I found. So that was quite an interesting experience. Going through school, it was tough. I mean, I did my best and come out with the grades that I needed to get, which was great. But, you know, particularly our West African families, there's a heavy focus on education. So there was times when my friends would come to the door, knock on the door. They would say, "Oh, can Ray come out and play football or do whatever?" And my mum and dad would be like, no, he's doing his homework. And I would get so frustrated because my friends would be playing out or playing Xbox or whatever. And I was doing my homework, and my sister, she was doing her homework. But I guess, you know, in the end, it paid off. But I suppose looking back at it now, those decisions I thought was my parents being awkward. But now I look back at it, I think they made some decisions predominantly to protect me and my sister, and obviously ensure that we did our best at school, because education was so important to them.
And that challenge is like, I know, like a lot of the traditional script around African cultures or Black cultures that that parents aren't invested in kids' education.
Correct.
So it's important to hear that story as well. When you mentioned about your father coming to Newcastle, a lot of the Ghanaian community, and specifically, what do you know the historical origins, the reasons for that, and not like London specifically?
Yeah, I think it's to do with the traditions and the history of the Northeast in general. So I think those that were in the shipbuilding or working on ships, such as my dad, Wallsend near Newcastle was massive for shipbuilding. So it made sense to gravitate to those places. So Liverpool would have been another one in the northwest. And then you had sort of like Newcastle in the northeast. So I guess you kind of went to the areas which specialised in your profession, to be honest. So imagine if you were wanting to, I don't know, be a bus conductor, or you could have got a job in London. But I guess for my dad, it ended up him moving to the northeast. I mean, imagine if, say, port, most of the ships were coming out of Portsmouth, my dad could have ended up there. But I think that's how it's ended. But now it's different. Now I think you have a growing diaspora of Africans all over, and in the northeast, it's still around the main cities: Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough. But you're starting to see that's not just necessarily related to jobs now, but in those days in the 60s, that was the situation.
Okay, I got you. And I know from the research that I've done, that's when I would say they started institutionalizing racism as well. And we'll talk a bit more about what racism is a bit later down the line. Okay, well, thank you for sharing some of your story. So what activities within your story, like what brings you peace, love, and happiness, you'd say? Because I know the work is it could be taxing, gratifying, and challenging, and at the same time, so what provides you peace, love, and happiness?
Great question. First of all, I have to say my family. My family brings me a lot of love, a lot of peace, a lot of happiness, because I get a lot of joy from my daughter, seeing her every morning, and doing activities with her, activities that she loves, not necessarily that I love, and that's probably something that I've inherited from my parents.
Okay.
And some things that perhaps I haven't, if I'm going to be honest, but I think what shapes me an individual is I get a lot of love from seeing the joy and happiness in my daughter and my wife. I also like, to keep myself sort of active. I think that's important. You touched upon how taxing emotionally, not often physically, when you're working in that space and you're working in that sphere of anti-racist practice, because there's not that many practitioners in the Northeast that do this role. And often when I'm engaging with staff and practitioners delivering sessions, the staff don't look like me, and sometimes that can be difficult. Sometimes it can be pushback as well, and that can be draining emotionally. There can be a lot of tokenistic gestures from outside parties. So I think sometimes it's I need to engage in activities which allow me to breathe, allow me to work on myself, and I find that through walking, I find that through cycling. I've got a gym in my house, so I use the gym quite a lot.
Oh, that's good.
But I like listening to music as well.
What type of music? Who's a go-to artist or genre?
I like a range of music. I like because of my West African heritage. I like a lot of. I suppose nowadays you call it Afrobeats, like a Zonto music, I like that. It originates from Ghana, West Africa, and I like that a lot. I like your old school R&B, not so much the new stuff now.
Okay, like 90s or So I'm assuming you're a millennial.
Yeah, I'm a millennial.
So am I too. I am too. So when you say old school R&B, like what comes to mind?
I like people like Ashanti. I like sort of like the old school hip hop from like Dr. Dre.
Okay, I got you.
That kind of stuff. Yeah, and
I'm very similar.
Yeah, but I also like as well. I like Afro house. So
Afro house. Okay.
Yeah. So I like house music, but Afro house is like house music with like some Afro beats underlying that, underpinning that.
Okay. Do you know any artists that?
Yeah. So there's a great South African DJ called Black Coffee.
Black coffee. Okay, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
listen.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
black
yeah,
coffee.
yeah.
Cool.
And the house scene in the Northeast is pretty big. The Northeast is pretty big for dance music and
Okay.
house music. So there's a lot of local DJs that have now become big that I like. There's a guy called Christoph. Funny enough, years ago I used to go to the same gym as him when he was just starting out. Really nice guy. Spoken to him a couple of times since.
Okay.
So yeah, they're sort of like my main sort of genres that I
Okay.
listen to,
Afro house. All right.
Yeah.
I'm definitely gonna have to try that out.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
that's
it's good,
cool.
yeah.
All right. And now, so you said like I know you mentioned your daughter, right?
Yeah.
So how is your daughter now? If you don't
She's
mind me
6.
asking? 6. Okay. So is your daughter dual heritage? I'm assuming. That means
Yeah,
mixed
yeah,
heritage?
yeah, yeah.
How, is that a growing population in the Northeast? Do you think, or how do you know?
I would say so. I would say so, and I would say
Mhm.
so in the sense that it's not just the stereotypical dad is black and mum is white. Actually, I'm seeing a lot of children where their mum is black and their dad's white.
Okay.
And I think mixed heritage, not just among black and white ethnicity. I'm also seeing a lot of white and Asian.
Yes.
And also as in white and South Asian, white and East Asian. And
Sorry to interrupt, but as someone who does anti-racist work, right? I know, and this is still predominantly white space in the Northeast.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I know there's a few. I know I had a recent Viber whose daughter is mixed heritage, dual heritage, and as a father and as anti-racist lead, like what suggestions or what type of tips could you give parents or guardians that have to raise dual heritage children?
I would always keep the conversation about race and ethnicity open.
Mm-hmm.
No question from your child or children or family members should be classed as silly questions. Really, they shouldn't be closed down because more often than not, it's not the child that you're having the conversations with. It could be family members as well.
Mm-hmm.
Who are sometimes curious or sometimes may have views that are different from your own.
Right.
So I would always encourage the conversation in a safe way. Obviously, if you're speaking to younger children, make sure it's age appropriate. But I think it's important to encourage the conversation rather than closing it down, because that can lead to perhaps more harmful consequences later on down the line.
Okay.
But I'm a big believer in what my wife and I do with our daughter is she does come home and she does often say things such as, I'm a peachy colour, or I'm peachy brown, or how come everybody is white and I'm not, and how come mum you're white and dad you're black and I seem to be in the middle. So we just have gentle age-appropriate conversations about why she looks like she does, why her hair is very different from her mother's. And I don't have much hair, as anyone can tell, but when I did have hair, it was slightly different again. But obviously, both my parents are black, and my mum has lighter skin than my dad, and she asks questions, about where my parents are from and things like that, and where her mum's parents or my wife's parents are from. So we always encourage those conversations in our house, and
that's good.
We don't shut them down. I believe that's important.
And maybe I'll ask you something about this later around the level of patience and how those conversations differ with children based on adults.
Yeah.
You know how you know what I mean? Maybe we'll talk about that later, but okay. But thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
You talked about family, but can you think of anybody influential, maybe outside of your family, that at different stages of your life that has been really influential to you as a person and your work that you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose in the first stage growing up, outside, it was those individuals I was referring to earlier on, those elders of the Ghanian community that had arrived around the same time as my dad, who had pretty much seen it all. And, like my aunties and uncles, they were, when my dad went away to work at sea, they would come around and help support my mum. So if my mum needed childcare, me and Cassie would go, and Cassie's my sister, we would go and spend time at their house. So they were quite influential because my mum could have very easily sourced white childminders. And I mean, she did at some stages, but I think the difference of spending time with these aunties and uncles, bearing in mind we weren't blood related to them, they still never let me forget about my roots and my origin. So that was quite important for me. So they were influential in that respect. And it was the same going to school. Going to university, those elders were getting slightly older now, and I was, university, you're independent, right? So I started to make friends who were sort of a similar sort of background to myself, and they became very influential. And one of those individuals is actually white British, but he became my best friend, and he's best man at my wedding. I was best man at his wedding, and he's godfather to my daughter, and I'm godfather to his two children. So he's been a massive influence in my life. And I mention that because it's very easy to say, because he's white, that he wouldn't have that influence, but he does, because he always encourages me to think about things from a different perspective. So yeah, and also now, I mean, there's so many people that I look up to now, as in addition to the people I mentioned there. I mean, my current manager's really, really progressive, really forward thinking, and I think when you're in this space, people can often shut doors in your face. They can often be barriers, they can often be pushback.
Yeah, it's true.
But my manager's got this gift of opening those doors, of giving you that confidence, giving you that encouragement. I think that's really important. I've got a good management team, got a good strategic team that think along the same path. Durham's really progressive as a local authority for that. But there's also people as well out there, the likes of Millie Kerr, who was the first anti-racist practitioner in children's social care in Brighton. She was appointed in 2020. Obviously, that was an important year because that's not only COVID, but that's the murder of George Floyd and the sort of re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and Millie was the pioneer. So I think it's really important to honour Millie in that respect. And there's also Wayne Reid. Wayne Reid's works for BASWA, and as well in social work, we talk about it being predominantly a white space, and in Northeast England again, it's a white space, but there's not many men in social work, and there isn't a great deal of black men. And Wayne Reid is a black man. He's born in Yorkshire, but he's been a great advocate for anti-racist practice, and he was obviously fighting that fight, the good fight, throughout COVID when it was difficult and everything literally moved from being in the office to online spaces pretty much overnight. So you've got the likes of Wayne Reid, who I look up to, Antonia Ogundaisi from Essex. She's a team manager there. Again, she's a service manager in anti-racist practice. And Chantel Thomas as well. Again from BASWA. Again, a great character in anti-racist practice. So there's lots I could go on for forever and a day. Dr. Dan Allen. He's a lecturer in Liverpool Hope University, specialises in the Gypsy Roma Traveler community. Fantastic professional.
Okay, that's cool. I'm doing a talk at it's for a social work conference. Have you heard of the ICANN conference before?
I have, yeah.
I'm doing a talk there on my 6 racism education processes. So it's around how each process I would say from primary school all the way to graduate school. It's like there's different types of racialized experiences within that, right? And I'm trying to make sure my mic is really. Let me fix this mic. Sorry, y'all. I had to switch cords today, but I'm trying to make sure. Okay, we're okay now. Okay, good. But now I was trying to figure out the name of the person who runs this organization. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, but it's important when we talk about social work and But what are some of the most challenging moments for you, would you say?
I suppose in my career now, there's lots of different challenges. Some of the challenges are completely out of my control, such as finances. What I mean by that is we're in an age now where, particularly local authorities are their funding is less and less. So that's a particular challenge about how we can be creative with my role.
Okay.
When there's less and less finances available compared to when I first started as a practitioner, 2015, which is like 10 years ago. But there's also challenges in the area in terms of the political landscape. I mean, if you go back to July and August last year, you had the Hare Hill riots in Leeds, where there was riots in the Gypsy the Roma Traveler community.
Right.
And then there was also the riots in particularly in the north and the northeast, the race riots in August. That was a big challenge, but it also has a challenge in terms of how people think about my role. It's challenging because the rhetoric around my role is that it's anti-white. It's it promotes, it creates. I would say, well, I don't agree with it, obviously, but there are people, particularly on the right wing of politics, that say equality, diversity, inclusion work promotes substandard and creates a substandard in terms of employment, i.e. promotes people to positions that they have no business to be in. And I regularly break down that discourse when I'm delivering my sessions, when I'm doing my training. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people that subscribe into that narrative, which makes it particularly challenging because it's almost like they don't want to have the time to understand your work or your narrative. So that again can be a big challenge because that's a big national rhetoric.
And how has Trump influenced that at all? Because I know in America it's DEI, but here it's EDI. Has the movement there impacted some of the progress or has it become a barrier here at all? Or?
Great question, fantastic question, because I would absolutely say yes. The sort of emergence of Donald Trump and his stance against DEI, as they say in America, has impacted on how people see EDI over here in the UK. Particularly if you look at some of the political parties, they're jumping on Trump's sort of rhetoric and bandwagon. So that can be difficult because I feel as though we've made some progress in terms of anti-racist practice. But I'm a big believer in that, we can continue to overcome that. Remember earlier I was saying when my dad came here in the 60s, there was none of this EDI is what you and I define it now. And he had to go through an awful lot of pushback and abuse and nasty rhetoric. And I suppose when you were talking earlier about inspiration and people that I look up to, obviously my number one is my dad from and my parents for what they've been through. So I look at them and think they've been through a far more difficult time. And I'm not for 1 second underplaying or underestimating how difficult things are now, particularly for people from the black and global majority and other diverse backgrounds. But I do believe I've got the strength and character that I can, we can overcome this, and I'm determined to do that.
You're right. And do you think your parents, because I know they came in the 60s, did they ever imagine it being at this point? Because every generation has its different battles, doesn't it?
Correct,
right.
Yeah.
Do you know how they thought your reality would be when you're maybe their age, or did they ever talk to you about that? Or
yeah, they did. Most West Africans will tell you that's all that their parents ever spoke about. And I think that helped shape who I am, because I always had that talk pretty much like I give my daughter all the time. And my parents were always saying, look, Ray, be careful, because at some point your friends who you think are friends now, they may not like you when you get a bit older, when you start competing for jobs and start competing for houses. They may not like you, and it won't be because of something you've done, it's because of something that you can't control. I didn't understand that then, but I understand that now. So I think my parents kind of, they didn't have a crystal ball. They didn't predict the future, but they kind of, you know, preparing me for if things got difficult, it's usually going to be people that are from the black and global majority, or people perceived to be not originally from the UK, who are going to be targeted. So I was kind of prepped from early. I was kind of prepped from young to be resolute, to understand that there'll be difficult times along my journey and my sister's journey where we're going to get a lot of pushback, we're going to get a lot of hate because of the way we look like. And
can you, when you had those conversations, if you remember, like, do you remember how you felt? Like, how did you feel after those conversations when you were younger?
Yeah. Well, I remember the very first time my mum and dad would say things like that, I would be like, what on earth are you talking about? Right. Because I was like, you know, these are my friends. I can't see them, they're my friends. But, you know, as I get older, I think mum and dad are right, you know. But, you know, they've experienced that themselves. But I think you could say that to, a lot of teenage things, right? You know, when you're a teenager, or you're a young child, your parents tell you something, give you advice. You often think, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, but right. they do. But I think it's very different when you start talking about race as opposed to, you know, going out and having fun. There's a difference because, as I was saying earlier, there wasn't many people that looked like me growing up.
Right. So,
but I started to see things, and bit by bit, my feelings towards my parents' words of advice started to change. For example, me and my white friends, there may have been 9 of us, or say 10 of us, 9 white friends, and then just me. There'd be, one of my white friends may have done something or caused a bit of problems, and I might have been there in the crowd, but then it was always me getting the blame, because it was easier to describe. There was a black person, then they'll describe all the other, you know. So don't get me wrong, there was times when perhaps I may have done something that I shouldn't have done, but the blame for me was always worse than what it was for my white friends, and I was thought, why is that? I did, you know, and then as my concept started to understand really what went on, I started to think, mum and dad, you know, they actually knew what they were talking about. So that kind of got instilled in me early, and I kind of realized that racism is probably more serious than what I thought.
It's interesting because when you grow up in like a predominantly white context, I know I did as well. It's like there's this hyper visibility, but this invisibility at the same time that's happening simultaneously. You know, and we can definitely have more conversations around that another time. But but thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your story as well. Now we're gonna get more into like the flipping questions. Okay, before we get into that, right? I have a question. You, who do anybody say you look like somebody? Is there a specific actor that people say you look like? No. Okay, this is not gonna blow your mind.
Go on.
Did you watch Fresh Prince?
Yeah. Fresh Prince. Yeah, Will Smith. Yeah.
Jeffrey.
Oh, really?
That's a little lighthearted conversation. Now we get lighthearted conversation. But I was thinking that when you were describing yourself, but I love Jeffrey. But man, you could be a cousin, a relative. That's funny. But if you watch the show again, people watch the show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Yeah. This is Jeffrey, man. That's cool though.
I thought you were going to say Uncle Phil there, so I'm all right with Jeffrey.
but Jeffrey, I was thinking like, man, wow, you look just like Jeffrey. But I love that show. Yeah. I thought maybe you might have heard that or not. Okay, but that's cool because I know Fresh Prince is big out here as well.
I mean, funny enough, although like I said, I've mentioned I was one of very few sort of black children in the area. I still watched a lot of TV where I saw representation, even though it was quite difficult back then. But Fresh Prince was great for that. There was another program you may not be familiar with called Desmond's.
Yes, I've heard of the Desmond's.
Oh yeah, Desmond's. Yes.
Not from being living here, but not.
So Desmond's, I'd watch a lot of Desmond's. Keenan and Kel, who loves orange soda. I used to watch a lot of that as well. There was a lot of stuff that we watched on. It was mainly American programs because you talk about the hyper visibility and the invisibility. Where the American programs, there was a lot of more visual representation. So it was a lot of stuff that was on like Nickelodeon. Right. Even things like we used to watch like Hey Arnold.
Yes,
That was like a lot more diverse than the equivalent programs that were in the UK at the same time. And then obviously sport, you know, black athletes. There was, so
I got you. Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, because I know being here, like there's a lot of similarities, right? And I think people once we get to like those more, I would say those critical conversations, like we talk about race, and then all of a sudden race isn't the same. As racism is not the same here as it is in America, right? So, but there's similarities and there's differences, right? But there's definitely racism here, which we'll get into now. All right. So now this is the part of the show where we'll get more into your work and how you flip the script, right, to traditional narratives within it. So I've had a chance to do an overview of some of your work and obviously talk to you a bit about your anti-racist lead. Much of your work is around EDI and anti-racist practice and social work specifically. So for our Vibin audience and us too, let's attempt to flip the racism and social work script, shall we? Now within these conversations, you know, a lot of like what I like to try to have a holistic framing when it comes to this stuff, right? So, but it's very important to understand the roots of what we're talking about. So if we're talking about racism specifically, what would be your definition of racism for our audience? Yeah,
so my definition is the mistreatment and often maltreatment of people where one individual or one group of people is using power, because I think power is important in acknowledging the definition of racism, to exert their beliefs that their nationality, ethnicity, skin colour, beliefs on religion are better than another individual or another group of people.
And that when you hit on here, that power is very important, right? Because that is what differentiates what you would say, like what racism and like say racial prejudices or racist ideas, right? And I guess like you mentioned, that power makes it institutional, individual, group,
absolutely,
conscious, unconscious, absolutely. Right?
And that also determines why there's still structural racism about, if you look at, you know, the prison system in not just the United Kingdom but also in the United States as well, you know, the criminal justice system, and I deliver a lot of training in my sessions around how even in social work we can perpetuate white privilege and make our practitioners really understand what I mean by that and how we do that as practitioners. But I think power is so key, because often in the work that we do, we are disempowering families, and it's so important to understand that when you work with children and families, because by virtue of the legislation and the principles of the Children Act, we're supposed to work in partnership with families, and social workers are taught when they're studying for their degrees about anti-oppressive practice and about the concept of power. So essentially, I'm not teaching anybody anything that they've never heard of before or not come across. I'm just reminding people that we need to go back to basics and understand actually that we need to break down barriers. And when people say, oh, this particular community are very difficult to engage with, I say, no, they're not very difficult to engage with. Just there's been barriers put up because somewhere down the line is put on, it's overpowered them and made them feel isolated, made them feel as though they're not part of the community, they're not included. We're wanting to be inclusive, so we're wanting to break down those barriers. We're wanting to empower families, not disempower families. And that is everything from the language that we use, the methods that we use, our body language, the way we communicate with children and families from diverse backgrounds. So I think, understanding the definition of racism is really important. And I'm glad you asked me that, because I always refer to that when I'm delivering sessions. I always put a slide on which defines racism. I think it's really important.
Well, that was powerful. Thank you for that. I want to take a sip while I check the thing real quick. Want to take a sip of water. All right, just taking time. We're okay. I know you mentioned white privilege as well. Would you be able to, I guess, kind of define that too, or is?
Yeah. So, white privilege, by my concept, is it's essentially not saying that because you're white, you're entitled. You're all of a sudden entitled to benefits or what have you. It's just about understanding that because you are white in some spaces, and I'll come on to that in a second. There are some things in life that you perhaps don't need to go through or haven't endured or don't suffer as much as compared to those that are from diverse communities.
Right.
For example, if you've got a Bangladeshi woman who's got the same qualifications as a white British woman and they put down their name on their CV, somebody might look on the Bangladeshi lady's CV and note that it's a Bangladeshi name and start making assumptions straight away.
Right.
But if your name is Sandra Thompson, I don't know any Sandra Thompsons, by the way, but if your name's Sandra Thompson, you may not have anybody doubt you, your ability based on your name. So it's things like that, because often people say to me, "Oh, Ray, white privilege doesn't have impact on me." It's not true, because here I am, a white British person living in a council house, living in poverty, and that's where I make the sense of saying in some spaces, the color of your skin actually, it doesn't. I'm not saying it entitles you to lots of different benefits. What I'm saying is, there's some things that you don't have to go through. Right. And because of the color of your skin, and that's just an example around sort of employment. Also, we talked earlier about the criminal justice system. And we talk about you can look at, there's lots of research out there that shows when white and black people have committed similar crimes, the criminal justice system would be more punitive on black people for this, for the same, so you have to question, well, why is that? And when you look at outcomes in health and education, we talk about black women, more black women are likely to die in maternity wards rather than white women. And we look at the rates of and the performances of black children as compared to white children and children from South Asian backgrounds.
You definitely hit it on the head. Like even like the research, even for instance, it's come out now that the whole DEI in America. How they're trying to remove all that, in affirmative action primarily benefited white middle class women.
And
then when they talked about removing what was it? I forgot, some certain type of a DEI initiative. When it came out that it benefited 50+% of white middle class women and only 4% of black people. So there's this drastic thing now. I guess now there's Trump protests this weekend, and I know a lot of the black community are actually like, there's like this meme or like there's like this dialogue going on now that we're gonna sit this one back, chill out. And it's interesting how you say that, because there's like this level of when there is inequalities, it's there's more. It seems like it's more responsibility on us and more labor on us to try to do something about it. So, for instance, they're asking where Kamala Harris is at when all this is happening. No one asked where previous vice presidents were at when certain things happening. Exactly. Well, all of a sudden, it's the black woman have to come and try to be a savior when she tried to explain to y'all exactly what was going to happen, and it's happening now. Y'all are frustrated, but now, you know what I mean? So, like everything you said, you hit it on the head, and then also, I guess that white privilege part. It's interesting how when we talked about culture and how when in this culture, it seems like when we think about privilege, it automatically goes to economics, right? And it goes to like, I am underclass. I'm in an underclass. I'm the working class. And I guess what you mentioned hit on the head is more of this concept called white priority. So it basically means, like what you just said, it's about, and it's an absence of an obstacle rather than a positive advantage. So for instance, it's like what you mentioned about just being in a space with your friends. The hypervisibility, you experience an obstacle that they don't have to experience based off of just being black. Does that make sense? Or let's say, for instance, if I'm driving, and I know my mom told me a story. I tell the story all the time. She was just driving during the Trump election. People are beeping their horn, flicking her off. They had Trump flags or whatever. By virtue, you can just say by virtue of her blackness, right? And if that's someone who is white, that may not necessarily happen to you. Does that make sense? So it's just basically it's not the absence of opportunities. It's that you're I keep forgetting this definition, whatever. But that's basically what it is. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
And that's something that I would agree with. I'll give you another example. In the race riot in August, and I know this because these are accounts given to me from our staff members in Durham. We had black and Asian members of staff driving in places like Middlesbrough, where there were groups of people, white people, stopping cars, and what they were saying was if the drivers of the cars were white, they were letting the drivers drive past. If the drivers were black or East Asian or even South Asian, they were assaulting those drivers. So that for me is where you can define white privilege by example. Like they wouldn't have assaulted you if you were white, right, even if you spoke with an Eastern European accent.
Right. And
we know this because that was evidently happening in Middlesbrough. So that for me is an example of it. I mean, I understand in terms of, you know, the Gypsy Roma Traveler community, because, you know, your Irish travellers their ethnicity is white and in some cases white Irish, and they do experience a lot of discrimination, and we've had a lot of work with Dr. Dan Allen and his team over at Liverpool Hope University. And, you know, the Gypsy Roma Traveller community are the biggest ethnic group here in County Durham. Okay. So I am aware that they experience a lot of discrimination. But again, you know, for members of those communities, there's some part of that discrimination which would be even magnified in some cases if that happened to a black person. And there's some part of discrimination which they may not experience because looking at them, they are of white complexion, right, they're of white ethnicity. So that's why I always say, when you ask me the definition, in some cases, because I do recognise that people have said to me, oh, but you can't be racist to white people. I always say that's incorrect, because I've seen in practice where there's been white British people and they have discriminated against people from the Irish travelling community or from the Roma travelling community. So I do see that. I do see that there's this discrimination there. However, when we're talking about white privilege, that's essentially what we're talking about in terms of that pyramid of discrimination, that by virtue of having white skin, there's certain obstacles you may not need to overcome as compared to somebody who's from the black and global majority background. And
you hit it perfectly on the head. It's like, call it the white skin capital in a way. And that, like you said, there's the social, cultural, economic element within that, and some people fall in different categories or all simultaneously. And I found the definition. I'm sorry, I always remember this, but basically white priority is a felt sense of coming before someone else. And an absence of an obstacle rather than a positive advantage, like I said before. So there's differences within that, and people try to specify, oh, there's a difference between white race class groups. You know, so that's the point. Thank you for that. Now, when we talked about racism and white privilege specifically, right? What are your perceptions of like traditional and normative narratives in social work where racism kind of creates those narratives, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the big one for me is views on parenting. You know, for me, the legislation around what supports children's social work is embedded. The main one's the Children Act 1989, and the concept around that forms our views and when the local authority, as in social workers, should intervene in the life of families. Now, a lot of it is around whether or not we feel as though, or we can evidence that children have suffered significant harm or likely suffer significant harm, or their health and development is likely to be impaired, or the child's disabled, or the child is likely to have an impairment in their health and development unless we provide services. Now, where it gets interesting is how social workers have developed a sense of what is good enough. What is good parenting? What does good parenting look like? Now, how do you judge that and what do you compare it to? A lot of practitioners compare it to their own standard of parenting. Now, bearing in mind, in England, a lot of social workers are white, middle class, and female. So they're often comparing families who, in some cases, do not look like them, do not parent like them, do not have their homes. Some may not even live in homes, some may even live in trailers. And they're comparing those families to their own standards because of how they parented or how they were parented. So I find a lot of social work practice is very Eurocentric.
Okay.
So I think that's a traditional script for social work. Sort of, it's a model where this is how we parent in the UK. This is how we think good parenting looks like. This is what we think a house should look like. Note I said house, where some families may not have lived in houses, may not live in houses in the UK. They may live in trailers, or they may live in other forms of accommodation. Right. And I think that's been the traditional go-to for social workers. And that's kind of fed into our assessments, our practice, and how we work with children and families.
Wow, thank you for that articulation. That was really good. Within that, is there like specific legislation that kind of, I would say, not counteracts, but kind of supports that script, if that makes sense? Kind of what we talked about earlier, in a way.
Yeah. So there's been changes along the way, but there's been lots of cases in the past where, unfortunately, children have suffered significant abuse at the hands of their parents or family members, and they've lost their lives. And the government have amended pieces of legislation. One such has been the amendment of the implementation of the 2004 Children Act after the murder of Victoria Climbié. And when we spoke about earlier around the Children Act 1989, doesn't really lend itself to modern day families in the sense of the makeup of those. I believe, in my interpretation of the act, that it's based on the traditional concept of families, of having a mother, having a father, and then having a couple of children that live in the same house. We're starting to see more and more the culture of families now is you have blended families. You have maybe mum and dad are separated. You have a stepmother, you have a stepmom. You have half siblings, you have step siblings. And also you have to remember in some of our African communities, in our South and East Asian communities, in our Gypsy Roma Traveler communities, they have larger families. They have nuclear families. They have families where you may not be related to somebody, but that you call them your cousin, you call them your auntie, you call them your uncle. And I think we're starting to move now towards a concept of kinship care, where previously in the past we would have said, who is this person you're calling auntie? Who is this person you're calling uncle? They're not really your auntie, they're not really your uncle. Talk to me a bit more about that. Explore that relationship a bit more. Now we are still exploring that relationship, but we're encouraging practitioners to be curious around that, but also using empathy to be culturally competent to encourage that relationship. So if there's an issue within a family now where there's an issue between parents, or there's an issue with one of the children which is having a negative impact, which is likely to form a compromise on the child's health or development, or it's placing that child at risk of suffering harm, practitioners are getting better now at identifying who those family members have close relationships with, whether it's those aunties and uncles in inverted commas or actual biological relationships, and encouraging those individuals to be part of those family plans to support the family very, very early on, rather than waiting until social workers go through the child protection stage, which is an escalation of concerns. And if there's more worries, it goes through the court process, which may result in children being separated, in some cases permanently, from their parents, and in unfortunate cases, siblings. We're starting to identify who are those family members earlier on, which I think is fantastic, particularly for our more diverse communities, because sometimes, unfortunately, the research says that children from the Black and global majority in the Irish Traveller and Gypsy Roma community are overrepresented in our cared for population, and their outcomes aren't as good as our white British children. And we see that, and later on in life, it's reflected in, the mental health system, the criminal justice system, the education system. in the employment system. So we're starting to make some changes, and the government's starting to really push some work around the kinship care. Started to release some guidance. There's been some guidance around that. And I was at a launch a couple of weeks ago of my assistant director of children's social care, head of children's social care, Rachel Farnham. We went to the launch of the Children's Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. They released a paper called it's Silent Race, Racism and Safeguarding Children, which was effectively looking at what practitioners, what local authorities can do better to support children where unfortunately they have experienced harm, but they are from the black and global majority background, and being confident to talk about racism. I think that's another thing. Some practitioners have been so uncomfortable talking about racism, they've not wanted to even discuss it in the assessment. They've not even wanted to discuss the nationality or the ethnicity of the family. Right. So part of my role, which was newly created in Durham, was helping people become comfortable with the uncomfortable. So helping people, encouraging conversations around culture and ethnicity, and helping practitioners relax around that, if I want to be informal, around that, and not be so nervous to talk and ask questions about race and ethnicity. I think that's the other thing we've seen in a lot of the research around race and ethnicity in social work. Practitioners who, like I mentioned earlier, are more often white middle-class women, are a little bit frightened to talk about ethnicity in case they get it wrong, or in case they get called racist. So a lot of my work and my role is helping people just have more confidence and ask the right questions.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And when you mentioned about, I guess, about the work that you do, right? When did you start your role?
I started in October.
In October. Okay. Yeah. Wow. How's it going so far?
It's fantastic. It's very interesting. I'll be honest, it has its challenges, but it's incredibly rewarding. You can see the difference that you're making in terms of practitioners, in terms of the work that they're doing with children and families, which is by far away the most important thing. But also in terms of helping to change the culture. And I'm lucky to be in an environment in a local authority where they're very serious about wanting to be inclusive. They're very serious and very open as well to acknowledging that we're on a journey. We're at the start of this journey. There's some things that we may get wrong on this journey, but we are going to do what we can do to put that right. And I like that. I like that braveness, as I say. I like that honesty. And I like the difference that my role, albeit a small part, is playing to the wider team in doing that. But I believe in my role, I'm able to have those conversations with practitioners, but not just social workers, those that work in the police, those that work in our schools in the area, our health visitors, and also connect with our charity organisations as well, and also our universities and the likes of yourself and Dr. Susan Frank and so on and so forth. Mel, from your ADI team at the university, and along with yourself, and to help connect people that are already doing good work and build a network.
How do you, man? Because all this, like everything you just mentioned, like, so it's multidisciplinary, right? Yeah. The work that we do, and you mentioned about aunties and uncles, and we were talking earlier about how communal cultures is so embedded in from our backgrounds, and how anybody in our immediate circle or someone that we see consistently is going to be auntie or uncle, right? Or going to be cousin. What's up, cuz? You know what I'm saying? So it's just everything is communal, and it's just like we mentioned before about it takes a village, right? And I guess that's something that the Eurocentric narratives doesn't appreciate as much. Exactly. And then I'm going back to the point where you're making about how you go in the police, here, university, education. It's multidisciplinary in a way. And again, that's communal, right? Does that make sense what I'm trying to say? So
absolutely.
Right. And
absolutely.
How do you feel about that? I guess as far as like this whole, it's a you said network, but it's like it's like a familial, like it could be like a family network as far as when it comes to addressing these types of, I guess this type of practice, right? When it comes to racism specifically, or just inequality in general.
And I mean, that's a great point because, you know, I talk a lot about relating our practice as social work to the theories that we learn at university.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite ones is like the ecological systems theory. And we look at things like schools, and we look at things like the police, and we look at things like the health service. Actually, we're part of a system which children and families use. So we should really be consistent in the message that we're getting out there around anti-racist practice. So we should all be using the same language. We do that quite well in a local authority such as Durham. You know, we are very strengths-based in terms of the work that we do with children and families. So we really, really focus in on the strengths, because there's strengths in all families, even those which we think are really risky and really, really worrying. There's always a strength, even if it's just one. There's a strength. So because we've adopted what's called the science of safety model, which, interestingly enough, we talk about Eurocentric. That's been adopted from Australia. So we're kind of decolonizing social work.
What did you say that was called again? Sorry, the
science of safety.
Science of safety.
Science
model.
of safety framework. So we're decolonizing social work, and I'm kind of using my role to kind of help change the thinking of our partner agencies, like you said, multidisciplinary, because it is sort of familial around the work that we all do. We're all working with the same families, but we should all be working in an anti-oppressive way to help understand the sort of intergenerational trauma that racism can cause.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, because like you said, because the work I do in education, like I can, the work that I do within that field can make me imagine or have like more of a, I guess you could say, I can be more familiar. Well, if I'm familiar with that, then I can kind of get a grasp of social work. Does that make sense? It can be a different. Some approaches are different, but it's once you have that grassroots, like you said, the definition of racism, and all, you know what I'm saying, and how and white privilege and all those different methods like intersectionality, you can kind of, it really becomes a bit easier to digest once you have those initial uncomfortable conversations to be comfortable, like you said, right? That's very important. And like all families fight, you know. So that's what that's the thing, right? I mean, not all, but I don't want to generalize, but most families disagree and try to figure things out. And when we talk about families, we talk about England specifically. I know you talked about we know there's a northern and southern divide. Yeah. So within your work, or which I know you wanted to kind of briefly kind of highlight the South-centric bias. Yeah. Could you kind of explain that for us?
Yeah. So in the space of anti-racist practice, more focused, my argument is that because of the demographics of the south of England, it seems to be a lot more prominent there and a lot more focused around the south of England, which is very difficult for me to kind of accept and run with, because when you look at the riots that happened in August, and I know I do refer to that, but that was predominantly in the north of England. It wasn't in the south of England, and it had devastating consequences in the north of England. There is a big, population across the north of England. If you look at Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, Sunderland, and Middlesbrough. Now that work isn't being done up here. It's being focused and it's being concentrated in the south of the country. So what I've done with a colleague of mine, with the backing of Durham County Council and the Association of Directors of Children's Services in the Northeast, we've created a platform to deliver sessions for the Northeast England around anti-racist practice. So we've created anti-racist champions, which I'm really, really proud of, because that's my way of saying, okay, there isn't a movement in the North. I could have easily said, let's just go to whenever there's a conference, let's just go to one down south and just rest on that laurel. But I want to create those spaces up here in the Northeast, and I've been doing that, and I've been doing that with collaborations with people such as Ola, who's doing fantastic work. over in Sunderland, and I've been doing that by myself, really, with the backing of my manager. And it's not to be in competition, no. It's just that we need that work as well. You know, we don't have this sort of the demographics that there is down south. And often, as I've mentioned before, I can be the only, in a building of 100 people, I can be the only black person there.
Right.
That's daunting, that's intimidating, that's saps your energy, it can be draining, and you can become hyper-vigilant. You can be, I don't like using the term microaggressions, but you're far more susceptible to receiving microaggressions, I would argue, than you are down south, where there's far more likely to be more black people in that building. So we need a lot more. We need those conferences that and the movements that we're seeing down south. We need that up here, particularly in the northeast. We talked about the political climate earlier on. The political climate's very different here because of the rising levels of poverty. Poverty, we talked about intersectionality. Poverty's significant. The poverty levels in the northeast are, you know, really, there's some really deprived places. If you look at England as a whole, most of the deprived wards in England are in the northeast and in the north. So there's a lot of work to be done here in the northeast, and I'm just in some way very fortunate, but also excited to be playing a part. There is some good work that's going on here already, but I want a lot more, and I'm excited to have some creative ideas as to how to do that and take a lead on that.
Wow, thank you, because you've hit that on the head as well. Because I do some of my work is on interracial inclusivity, right?
Yeah.
Interethnic, and what I tell when people ask me how is England or how is I always say the Northeast is similar to the South in America,
Yes, it is.
and people don't, that's why it's because it's predominantly white, and I think it's important because, like you said, that Southern centric bias, because even when I was doing my PhD, I was the only black researcher in my whole department, right? There was no conferences on race. So that's why I'm trying to, like yourself, I'm trying to collaborate, and I've built something in this brand called the Resilient Thrivers, and I'm trying to get people who are early career researchers or community activists that are championing like anti-racist work or racial justice and social justice work simultaneously, because there's not much here, like when it comes to that. There's things that are happening, but it's just not as widespread. And like I said, it's important for everyone to collaborate, which is what we're trying to do, right? So but that's when people ask me, I say it's like the South in America, and
it is.
But the interracial, it's important as well for the other side, because when I was doing my research, there's people who are from London who, I guess they talked about there's a London bubble, but when they came out here to Durham, they realized that wow, it can be drastically different, because like you said, most people there are certain spaces that you can go to where you can feel, where you're not necessarily hyper visible. You can kind of you can mix with people from similar backgrounds to you, whereas here it can be very difficult and challenging to do that, right?
Absolutely. You know, that's a brilliant point, and I guess that's the advantage of being in the South. You know, you can have those spaces. You know, if you need to discuss something or share some resources or have a conference, you can just nip across in the tube to the other side of London or wherever it may be to have those. It's a little bit harder for us to do up here. I am confident that we will get there in time, and we will get there. And I'm very. It's one of my ambitions to sort of create a big space, and I'm kind of doing that in a minute with the anti-racist champions.
Right.
They're obviously in social work, but I would like to also create a space for those who are championing anti-racist practice and social justice. Not necessarily just in social work, though, in education, in housing, you know, and I'm doing a lot of that collaborative work, and I think it's important that we do that, because it does have great outcomes for inclusivity, but also great outcomes for our children and our families that we're working with.
Man, it's really good, man. I'm losing the questions, but this is really, I think you kind of hit some of my questions on the head. And so your work specifically, right? So you mentioned kind of what y'all are doing.
Yeah.
Could you share a particular moment in your life that you consider like a turning point for the work that you do?
Oh,
if that makes sense.
Great question. A turning point. Well, it was probably for me. I mean, unfortunately, I've had some negative experiences earlier on in my social work career, which then I never really thought about anti-racist practice when I first started as a social worker. I just saw myself as a social worker rather than as a black social worker. But for some negative experiences that I've had, anti-racist practice has always kind of been on my mind in some way or forth. And I think the turning point for me was there was 2 turning points. If I can cheat and say 2 instead of picking on one, it's really difficult. But they both kind of relate to the same thing. I think the first one has to be in 2020. It was the murder of George Floyd, the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then there was COVID. And Durham County Council, we created a staff network to support our black and global majority employees, because we recognised earlier on that, they didn't really have anybody to share their experiences with. In terms of, we talked about how isolating it was to be a member of staff in Durham from the black and global majority, when you're in spaces and in buildings where people didn't look like you, and then you were working from home. And don't forget, in COVID, there was a lot of people on the TV, or it was on the news a lot, I should say, where there was reports of black and global majority nurses and support staff dying from COVID. So it's a really difficult time. So I joined the staff network, and then within a few months I became the chair of that staff network. Okay. I think that was a big turning point for me, because I am still the chair of the Race, Equality and Diversity Network in Durham, which I'm still really very proud of and privileged to hold that position. And that enabled me to kind of channel my negative experiences around racism and turn that into a positive, and channel that positive energy, because I wasn't just thinking about myself, I was thinking about other people, and I was thinking about how I can use my negative experiences to make it a safer space for our black and global majority staff. And then obviously the next one was the August riots, because that happened just before I started my job. Cool. So it was almost like a baptism of fire, really. But I was fortunate that I had a good team around me at Durham to support me through that, but also give me the platform to use my position in the staff network as a chair, but also my then upcoming new job, which I'm in now, to have conversations with staff. I was given a wide audience, like 200 staff on Teams, 150 plus on Teams, to kind of talk and share people's lived experiences of racism and make people more aware of racism.
That's a good amount of people.
Yeah, so those were the 2 big turning points for me in sort of like my career with regarding anti-racist practice.
That's a great point when you talked about, like, especially the numbers as well, because I've been trying to decipher lately about how, because the Northeast community, there is a really communal community as well. There's really nice people out here, and but I was in Newcastle on Saturday, right?
So was that
you were?
It was busy.
So yes, it was really busy because they won the cup, right?
Yeah.
And but I was house viewing, but we were coming back, and it makes me think about this work that we do as well. It's like there's always a few bad apples.
Yeah.
And those bad apples can sometimes can generalize a community. Does that make sense? But majority of people are just walking, going home. You know what I mean? But there's just a few people who do certain things that can be, I would say, so drastic. Like, say, for instance, we're on the train and the train was like delayed 30 minutes or so because there was a fight on the train, right?
Yeah.
People yelling, etc. about whatever. But that's still like a smaller amount of people. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it does.
But then there's also people who are more neutral. And I know Audre Lorde says, silence is violence. Yes. And it's about it's hard to decipher that, right? But it'll be good that we could talk about that another time one day if you want to have you back on here, about how the different levels and how much are we generalizing and how much is actually true.
Yeah.
How much is actually happening.
Yeah.
Okay. But for your work and everything that you just mentioned, I know time frame is tricky, but how is your research and activism specifically flipping the script when it comes to the racism in social work?
Yeah, so how I'm flipping the script is I'm, encouraging practitioners to think differently about A, how they were brought up, and B, how they were taught to practice social work. And that's how I'm flipping the script, because there's been a narrative for some of our, predominantly our white practitioners, but not just our white practitioners. I was taught the same way as them, and it's about recognizing that some of the assessments that we use to see what services may benefit a family, or what services they may need, the methods, the tools that we use, they may not be culturally appropriate for the diverse families that we're now working with. And some of our practitioners perhaps don't realize what else is out there. They're not curious at that point to ask what else they can do differently. That's where I come in with my evidence-based tools, my research-based tools that people have shared with me kindly. Right. And I just share that with practitioners and say, look, if you're wanting to do an assessment, here's a set of reflective questions which help you understand those lived experiences from that family, from a cultural perspective. I also help practitioners understand that the way they were raised is fine. I'm not in a position to judge that. I don't have a moral compass in that respect. However, I encourage practitioners to think that just because you didn't allow your child to sleep in a bed with you until that child was 7, doesn't mean that if you've got a Nigerian family or Ghanaian family where they're doing that, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's some form of abuse going on. There's just different cultural differences in some aspects of parenting. Don't get me wrong, where it's harmful or we can evidence abuse, then we act, because that's what the law tells us to. But in some cases where we can't evidence that, we shouldn't be so quick to jump to conclusions and suggest, there's abuse going on because they're parenting very differently to how we were parent here in the UK. So it's about breaking down those barriers and breaking down those narratives around Eurocentric parenting, Eurocentric views, Eurocentric teaching on social work, and helping practitioners to understand that actually sometimes different cultures, yes, they do things differently, and that's not always a bad thing. And it's about helping practitioners have a safe space to reflect on that.
Man, I could pick your brain all day. This might need to be 2 parts, but
yeah, we could do this.
I was gonna ask, because you mentioned about like parenting, I guess, as far as kids staying in bed till a certain age. There's actually research that came out that it's actually better for kids to stay in bed with their parents. I think it was like, don't quote me here, but it's like until like 5 years old or something like that. So, and I was gonna ask about 2 things. How much is trust related into your work? And also the second thing goes back to what you mentioned about how we just mentioned about how the Eurocentricity in a way kind of creates barriers for anti-racist work. But then at the same time, once they realize some of our cultural understandings and how we do things, they end up appropriating and using that. Yeah. Right? Does that make sense what I'm trying to say? Absolutely, yeah. But in a different way. So like I know, like say nature now, typically Eurocentric doesn't really didn't care for nature. That makes sense why you have the climate control and everything like that. But in our indigenous practices, Mother Nature is important, right? Yes. Praying for food, doing these types of things. Yeah. And now all of a sudden it's becoming a bit more normalized in the mainstream or in Western society, right? Yeah. So could you explain on those 2 things? So specifically trust in your work, and then also how Eurocentricity or Western society is adopting the narratives that they thought were problematic in the first place. Yeah,
great question. So trust is really important because I try and build trust with my my colleagues that I'm delivering sessions to, whether it's staff in Durham or outside of Durham, because if they trust me, they're more likely to feel safe with me. They're more likely to have open conversations with me. They're more likely to learn. Right. If they don't trust me, they won't feel safe. They won't tell me some of the concerns or some of the worries that they have. They won't have a free debate. And I think going back to what I was saying earlier about having a discussion with my own family or my own daughter, I believe in opening up discussions around race and ethnicity. I do not believe we should be shutting them down. And that's being backed up by the government paper that the likes of Ghanian Davis were so influential on, that I was talking about earlier from the Child Safeguarding Practice Review panel. So trust is really important for me with the staff, but it's also really important when I'm working with children and families. Children and families that have suffered racism have suffered intergenerational trauma. Right. And when people say they don't engage, when people talk about the Gypsy Roma Traveler community, it's because of the racism that's being perpetuated towards those communities from the likes of ourselves, the medical professionals, the police. They've been victimized heavily, so they don't trust us. And when I say us, I mean public services a lot. So we have to rebuild the trust with those communities. So trust is doubly important, and a lot of the work I do is helping to, we talk about restorative practice and restorative harm. It's about rebuilding that trust. Let's sit down and have a mutual conversation where we say we recognize that we've caused that community harm. It might not be in us personally, but we recognize there's been harm caused. What can we do to put that right? It's about being empathy and being authentic, not doing it from a tokenistic point of view. And also in relation to the Eurocentricity and adopting of indigenous practice. I mean, I can go on all day about that. I mean, I spoke about science of safety, where in the United Kingdom, a lot of our local authorities and our children's services, children's social care departments, they've adopted approaches from different countries. So science of safety's come from Australia. You've got family group conferencing has come from New Zealand. Even the adopting of other approaches. So in central and southern parts of Africa, you've got the concept of Ubuntu. You've got some of the Maori practices again in New Zealand. You've got some of the Hinduism principles we've adopted. So there are a lot now of examples where we are adopting a lot of what I would call indigenous practices and bringing that into social work, whether it's in our leadership approaches, whether it's in our approaches working with families, and whether it's in our general frameworks. When I mean a framework is how we practice. So in Durham, we've got a wonderful framework, a practice handbook. So essentially, it's like I don't want to use the term dummies guide, but if you're new to the area, if you're new to the local authority and you want to know how to practice and how to be a social worker, children's social worker in Durham, you read this handbook. It's really good. It's really detailed. Okay. It's strengths based, and it's underpinned by science of safety. But what I like about it is in the new edition, there's going to be lots of talk about anti-racist practice in there, and it's just an example of Durham as a local authority being progressive and bringing in these different indigenous frameworks and indigenous practices and approaches and adopting that. So that is quite, you're starting to see that more and more. It's not as common as I would like, but we're starting to see that more and more, and I'm happy with that.
Well, that's good. That always leaves me with the question with, what are British values? What are Eurocentric values in the first place?
Well, it's
like democracy, maybe.
Well, it's interesting, but I mean, Europe wasn't the first, part of the world to have democracy. We know that, but that's what the history books tell us. Exactly. So British values, that's a big debate. It's a political debate that's raged, especially with the whole debate around immigration. But a lot of British values are actually not too dissimilar from values in other communities. That's why you're starting to see a lot of representation across the political spectrum. Gone are the days where those sitting on the right, particularly, all look the same in terms of the colour of the skin. That doesn't necessarily mean to say I agree with those people, but I do see that, when you talk about what British values, you talk about, family life, you talk about democracy and so forth, but you get a lot of that in West African views. I mean, family life is everything to our West African families. We would argue that religion's more important in West African cultures and Southeast Asian cultures than I would say in British culture now, because the evidence for me is, look how many more people go to church in West Africa and when they arrive here, and look how many people go to religious establishments in Southeast Asia. so on and so forth. So I would argue that a lot of what we would identify as British values, yeah, they are British values, but they're also values we share with a lot of our diverse communities. So I just think that we have to be careful, because I think it's been hijacked, that rhetoric, by people on the right and the far right of politics, to try and turn that against our communities that arrived from different countries and want to settle here and make a good life for themselves here. And I think that's being used against them. But I actually think that we have a lot more in common with those communities than what we're led to believe.
Right, because technically, like, history says that everyone, before capitalism, etc., feudalism, everyone was in a communal culture. So it's I guess the difference now becomes overcoming that those barriers like race, etc. Right. But you definitely hit it on the head, because we're more similar than different, aren't we? Okay, thank you for that. Now, where do you see yourself and your work leaving a lasting legacy and positively impacting others?
That's a great question. In terms of leaving a legacy, I think for me, I would like a legacy to be left of somebody who was very committed to anti-racist practice, who was very passionate around that and addressing social injustice, and trying to turn that to seek social justice. But I also want to create a legacy where people can look up to an individual who's almost set a pathway, particularly here in the Northeast, of promoting anti-racist practice in all walks of life, particularly in children's social care. Whether that legacy is somebody who's you can just ring up and have a conversation around a particular case, which there's a few cultural issues, whether that's a legacy that lasts electronically, i.e. somebody that's shared lots of practice resources, lots of books for practitioners to dip in and out of, or whether that's somebody that's put on some good reflective and creative spaces in training sessions or online sessions for practitioners to have really thought-provoking conversations around race and ethnicity. Those are the type of legacies, and that's a positive sort of impact that I want to be having as a practitioner.
Thank you. Very powerful. Thank you. Now, we're going to get to more of the concluding part of the show.
Yeah.
Where, Ray's going to offer us insight on rehumanization, right? For the rehumanization station. Now, first question would be around, if you could reflect on your journey thus far, what do you know now that you wish you knew before?
Wow. Being authentic to yourself. Confidence is everything, particularly for a black male growing up in the Northeast. Being true to yourself. I think sometimes when you are isolated, your personality, your character can drift into different spaces. These are some of the things that I kind of wish I knew back then. I think the way it relates to anti-racist practices, if you're not confident within your own skin in terms of, we talk about being Pan-African and understanding really what that means in your own history, you become insecure, and then when you come into these spaces around anti-racist practice, you're not confident enough to stand in a room with people who may have different views, and you can, it's a bit like being a tree without foundations and strong winds. But because of my views on those topics, I can look back now and say, if I was younger, perhaps those were the type of things I may have done slightly differently. But it's always a difficult question, that one. But I always think about my personality, right? Because I'm in that space now where if you said to me 10 years ago, where would I have wanted to be? I would have said this, but I would have thought that would have been a dream. So in a way, I'm kind of living that now. But I do think in terms of what I could do differently would relate to aspects of my personality rather than actual knowledge, which I think is important again, because growing up, an environment where near enough everyone looks differently to you, you can get lost. So one of the things that I would say is it's about being authentic as a young person growing up in an area, in an environment where people may encourage you to change. Just be true to yourself and believe in yourself.
Oh, thank you. And so I know we mentioned the definition of racism, but I guess to add on to that, now that you talked about what you know thus far, what would be your definition of anti-racism? And well, first of all, what did you think anti-racism was compared to now?
Great question. So for me, as a young person growing up, anti-racism was more around simply not agreeing with racist views. That's what it was to me in simple terms. Now, I would define that as being somebody who's non-racist. Because for me, you have somebody who's racist, which I described earlier. Then you have somebody who's non-racist, and you have somebody who's anti-racist. So somebody who's non-racist is very passive. Like you said, silence is violence. So if you hear a racist comment or you see something like a racist incident, a non-racist person may not wish to get involved, may look and think, I know that's wrong, but I may not do anything about it.
Right.
An anti-racist person isn't passive, they're active. So for me, it's if I see something at work that I might define as not being right, or I hear something and I think, oh, that's racist. If I don't do anything, I'm the non-racist. If I perpetuate that, then I'm being racist. But if I actively challenge that, then I'm being anti-racist. So it's now on the same definition as what I define for racism, but what I would add for anti-racist is somebody who actively challenges racism in terms of whether it's structural racism, whether it's online racism, verbal racism, interpersonal racism perpetuated through our practice. Thinking that okay, we're going to treat this Gypsy Roma family the same way we're going to treat this white British family, and not recognizing that they've got different needs. And anti-racists would challenge that and ask the question why. Why are we doing this, and to what benefit? Who's benefiting from that? Because it's certainly not the Gypsy Roma family. So also someone who promotes equity and equitable practice.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Amazing. I love that. That was cool. It's always good to hear someone else's perspective around that definition. You know. But yeah, it's important. Like you said, there's a difference between being anti-racist and non-racist, right? And like you said, there's a difference between and hopefully within the next generation, people can be more empowered to be anti-racist, right?
Absolutely. Because
you mentioned about that sometimes disempowerment, and depending on what culture you're in. But yeah, I guess that's important as far as the departments you're in, the workplace you're in, what type of culture are people willing to set, you know? Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, last question. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Okay, so like I said, today has been an amazing episode. We've talked a lot about racism, anti-racism, white privilege. We talked about the differences between white race class groups. We talked about social work and the differences between the South-centric bias and the northern bias. We talked about being hyper-visible in a predominantly white context. Some of your experiences and how you navigated that, and how you use your work now to champion anti-racism and allow people to be their authentic self. Now, what does rehumanization look like to you?
I love that question, because rehumanization to me looks at reconnecting the human form of social work. So when you look at social work, it was based on charitable values, in the 19th century, so late the 1800s. And as time's gone on, social work has become more and more of an administrative task. It's been a lot more around paperwork. It's been a lot more around processes as legislation's developed. As I mentioned before, serious incidents have happened to children, and the government have tightened up processes. What that means is more bureaucracy, more red tape. Social workers spending less and less time with children and families. What that means to me is that we've lost that humanization, in the sense that we're no longer connected to the families in our communities. We see that in terms of anti-racist practice. Our practitioners don't really understand some of our diverse communities. So rehumanization, to me, is reconnecting our practitioners to our communities, spending more time with our communities, understanding their needs, communicating with them a lot more. What that looks like in practice for me is having sessions where the practitioners are sharing their views on that, helping them engage with and be more culturally sensitive to our communities and their needs, and then helping our children and families understand that this is the work that we're trying to do with our practitioners. For me, it's almost like a mutual understanding. And I think when you've got community cohesion like that, when you've got practitioners in the community and they're in sync with each other, it leads to better outcomes because it reduces the barriers. Children and families no longer feel oppressed, no longer feel disempowered, no longer feel afraid of public services. And public services staff are no longer making negative assumptions of people from diverse communities. They are no longer escalating concerns, worries and risks unnecessarily with those communities because they better understand the needs of the families in those communities. So that's what rehumanization looks like, and that's my interpretation of it.
Okay, thank you for that. So basically, it's around reconnecting communities and just developing a mutual understanding so we can all be empowered. Really.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's cool.
Yeah.
So we talked all about that, like you said, like the whole indigenous communities and how kind of this some of the script that we see today can be Eurocentric, and it's about flipping that script in different ways, like you just said, about reconnecting, mutual understanding, removing certain prejudices and biases or stereotypes, right, that certain communities are pushing, like the right, like you said, like there's certain narratives that we have, like I mentioned, like democracy, how we think could be a British value, but in reality that's been going on, right? And in reality, in history, and historically before capitalism, etc., we did pretty much most of us lived in a communal society. So it's about focusing on the similarities rather than as well. Thank you for that. Now we're done. How you feeling?
Fantastic. Really enjoyed that.
Cool. Yeah, me too. Like I said, I don't know if I don't break it into two parts. I hope everybody's still with us at this point in time because it's been a really important conversation. I really appreciate you coming. Do you have any social media handles or platforms?
Yeah. So my main one is LinkedIn. So I'm just Ray Addai on LinkedIn. So just give me a follow on there or send me an invitation to connect. Ray
Addai on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And also you can see him on The Fresh Prince.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I'm playing. But thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. I really, it's been amazing to talk about this. Like I said, this is some of the work that I do as well. So it's good to kind of hear a different perception and a different discipline. You know, we'll definitely have you back on again. And this was his first time, y'all. So man, kudos to you. It's really good. Thank you. All right. That was an amazing episode. Once again. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Ray, for just vibing with me and allowing our listeners to get an idea of who you are, what you do, and what you do for a living. Your story was very amazing, very powerful. We spoke a lot about racism, what racism means, what white privilege means, just how you've navigated predominantly white spaces, and your personal experiences growing up and within the work that you do. Yeah, we need more people like you, man. It's a blessing and it's an honor to be able to share a space with you and vibe around anti-racist work, right? And your definition of rehumanization was very powerful around just reconnecting, having a mutual understanding for us to be our authentic selves, you know, and be able to be empowered, most importantly. And we talked a bit about, you know, whiteness and white privilege, and I hope my white audience gets an idea of when they listen to this, they think very critically around the privileges that they have, whether that's economically, socially, culturally, psychologically, by virtue of being white, right? What I call white skin capital. And I just want to say thank you again for coming, and I keep doing the work that you do on anti-racism. I'll have you on again. And for my Viber audience, thank you for tuning in. This is start now of season 2 of Collaborative Praxis series. Thank you so much for just just vibing and just being involved. And I want to just continue to grow this, keep sharing the platform. And if you know anybody that would be willing to like share their story and talk about the things that they do, please let me know, because what I try to do is champion people who are not spotlighted as much as I feel like they should be, right? It's the community, and it's the ground level grassroots people who are really the ones who shift and make changes, right? And distribute power in ways that everyone wins. So again, thank you for tuning in. One love.